Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this fifth session of the CIEM Vietnam webinar series 2023. Today's session will be dedicated to an integrated prospective assessment of climate impacts, adaptation strategies, and net zero strategy. The results presented today correspond to the part 3 of the final national report released last year on the occasion of COP27. The presentation today will be made by Dr. Etienne Espagne, who is senior economist at the World Bank and was previously at the AFD as leader of the CIEM Vietnam project. We also have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Dang Thi Thu Hoai, who is director of the Department on Sectoral Development Policy Studies at the Central Institute for Economic Management in Hanoi. So the presentation by Etienne will last about 30 minutes. Then we'll have about 15 minutes of discussion with Dr. Dang. And then the discussion will be open to the rest of the audience. So you can, of course, ask question you can ask question in the chat during the presentation. And then during the question session, you can also raise your hand so that we open the microphone and you can ask your question. So thanks a lot to both Etienne and Mrs. Hoai, and I leave the floor to Etienne.
Thank you, Marie-Noël. I hope you can hear me well, and also that you can see my screen. So thanks for the invitation. It's my pleasure to come back for a short moment to this CIEM Vietnam project. Actually, it should have been Thu Ha Nguyen who should have really presented this work, as she really put the most effort on the macro modeling side of the project, but she couldn't be available for this time, so I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, just a few elements for the memory of everyone in the audience of the history of this first CIEM Vietnam project that started in 2018 with an agreement between AFD and Monterey, and then led to a first special report for COP26. And today I will talk mostly about the macroeconomic model that was already used for the COP26 special report, but that was further developed in the COP27 reports, and particularly, as Marie-Noël mentioned, in this National Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation reports 2022. And so, as far as I'm aware of that, so there is a second phase of CIEM that is in preparation right now, and that will develop much more the mitigation side and the net zero strategy side of the macro modeling. So let me start with a few words on the macro model itself. Starting with the general approach of what we call the stock flow consistent modeling framework. The origins of this specific macro modeling approach come from a Yale group led by James Tobin, followed soon by the Cambridge Economic Policy Group of Wayne Godley, the 70s and 80s, and that tried to analyze the US and UK economy, particularly based on a rigorous accounting framework and comprehensive integrations of all flows and stocks of an economy. The idea is to focus on the interactions between the real and the financial sector, and taking into consideration the fact that financial constraints might have not only just short-run impacts on the real side, but also medium and long-run impacts. Then it's a simulation type model, so there's no optimization behavior over time. So we simulate alternative scenarios for the future, as you will see later. So the key principles are this stock flow consistent modeling approach is that we need to ensure the flow consistency so that there's no black holes in the economic system between debtors and creditors. There should be a intrinsic logic consistency. There is a stock consistency as well, so meaning that the assets and liabilities should be equal for all the different agents in the economy. And then there's also the stock flow consistency itself, so that the changes in stocks, either by changes in valuation or the changes in the positions of the actors in terms of financial assets, should exactly equal the flows at each period. Then it's kind of quadruple entry accounting principle, following the inflows, the outflows, the changes in assets, and the changes in liabilities at each period of time. The steps that are usually followed to build this kind of macro models is first to try to reconstruct the balance sheets and the flow matrix of an economy. Sometimes it's very few, summarized to very few sectors. In our case, we have 5 institutional sectors, as you will see later. Then write the accounting equations, work then on the behavioral equations, and most of the most important are the consumption and investment equations that they drive the whole dynamics of the model, and then validates the model itself on historical periods and simulate into the future using some hypotheses on exogenous variables and scenarios. So in the particular case of Vietnam, there are some difficulties in the building of such kind of model because the initial data are not readily available. So there are no institutional accounts. You can use the national accounts at some aggregated level based on the SNA 2008 principles. You have some national sources from the GSO, from the Ministry of Finance, state budget. But mostly you have to rely on international sources that are openly available from World Bank or IMF or ADB. And you're also limited in the level of disaggregation that you can expect. So for example, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to disaggregate different productive sectors of the economy on the financial side. So we haven't been able to do that aspect. So we have only the real side for the different productive sectors. So this is the type of flow transaction, non-financial transaction matrix that you end up with, and you can see the different institutional sectors. The important line, most important line, let's say, being the last one, where you have the net financial capacity of each institutional actor, and this net financial capacity has to be explained, let's say, by a certain portfolio position of these institutional actors. So I will. There are 3 main steps in the building of the model. So first, the central bank and commercial banks balance sheets. Then the extension to other sectors based on stock flow consistency. So for the first step, we have the real data. Then it's by let's say logical deduction that we can build for the other sectors the balance sheet of the sectors, then combined with other relevant financial instruments of sectors. I will move to let's say the key elements for the key institutional sectors, starting with the central bank. The central bank's functions in the case of Vietnam is, of course, to issue the currency, to regulate, let's say, the money supply, or through its monetary policy, and to act also as a banker for the government. And it has also a role in terms of the exchange rate policy, holding the country's foreign reserves and targeting, mitigating the shift in the exchange rate. So that leads to the balance sheet of central banks, as shown in these slides. On the asset side, domestic credit to governments, domestic credit to commercial banks, foreign reserves in central bank, and on the liability side, you have the currency and the commercial bank deposits in central bank. If you look at the commercial bank's balance sheet now, the role of the commercial banks are to facilitate savings by offering deposits, to provide loans to other sectors of the economy, and it's also an important transmission channel of monetary policy, so that the commercial bank's balance sheets on the asset side contains the credit to private sector, foreign reserves in commercial banks, and the commercial banks deposits in central bank. And on the liability side, you have the domestic credit from central bank to banks and the deposits from households or firms. And then by deduction, you can build the balance sheets of the other institutional actors of the economy. And you end up with this kind of simplified balance sheet of the Vietnamese economy. Let me move to the main characteristics of the model beyond this balance sheet construction principle. Apart from these accounting equations, so flow consistency, stock flow consistency, you have the question about the behavioral equation. So how economic agents determine expenditures, how do they finance their expenditures, and how do they allocate their wealth? How do they specify prices and wages, including interest rates, price of assets, etc., etc. So these behavioral equations entirely drive the relations between the financial side and the real side, and so the dynamics of the model in the long run. I will not detail this nice charts of the whole overall model, but I will speak about a few elements of the model. So first, on the output determination. So the productive sectors will produce what is demanded. It's a demand-led model. If the expected demand is lower than their capacity of production, firms cannot produce what excess the capacity, so that the excess demand would be imported. Expected demand could be adaptive, and this depends on past demand. And there is a supply constraint represented by a simple Cobb-Douglas production function. As I already mentioned, there's a key equation in all these kinds of models, which is the investment equation. So investment in our case depends on the profit rate and utilization capacity, but also on the lending rate and financial profitability. So that's a key link between the real sector dynamics and the financial sector dynamics. And then how is investment financed? So it is financed domestically through banks, credits, and equities, and externally through foreign direct investments, foreign loans, and foreign and portfolio investment. So you have to determine both the determination of the dynamics of investment, but also the way it is financed. On the consumption side, so consumption is supposed to depend on disposable income, mostly for the most important part, but also a little bit on the net wealth of the different agents. And then again, the way consumption is financed will depend on the portfolio choice of the households. So it can be through cash, dong deposits, foreign deposits, bonds, or equities. Now you have the government and fiscal policy of the government. So the revenues of the government are composed of taxes, other transfers or payments, and on the expenditure side, you have final consumption of the government, transfers and investment. what you can observe in past data is that the Vietnamese government tends to be more and more financed domestically rather than externally, which is a rather good sign in terms of the external fragility, potential external fragilities of the country. Hypothesis on the central bank and monetary side on prices. So the refinancing rate of the central bank is a function of the level of inflation, of the US interest rates, supposed to be the risk-free rate, and a function of the exchange rate. Then the lending rate of the commercial banks and the deposit rate of the commercial banks is supposed to be based on a premium over the central bank's interest rates. And finally, the international reserves follow the exchange rate variations. We follow here a reference from the IMF 2019, so that you can see the observed deposit rate, lending rate, and refinancing rates in the past from 95 to 2020 in Vietnam. And we have followed this, let's say, a premium hypothesis based on the refinancing rate. On the commercial bank side, banks satisfy the demand for financing of firms and households, but there is some credit rationing hypothesis, which is based on the actual financial regulations in Vietnam. So you have, for firms, you have a loans to value ratio, and for households, you have a debt to income ratio that limits the amount of credit that firms and households can ask to the banks. So there's a credit rationing hypothesis. Then banks purchase a fraction of government bonds, and commercial banks may finance the demand for loans of the domestic economy by issuing equities or borrowing from abroad. So we have a link here to the rest of the world and the exchange rates dynamics. Now, the rest of the world and the external dependency, real exports are assumed to be determined by the demand for imports of the main commercial partners of Vietnam, prices, the exchange rate, and FDI. And real imports are assumed to be determined by the domestic demand and the ratio between the import price and the domestic price and the FDI. So we have, in terms of prices, we have a GDP deflator, function of the wage rate, the price of imports, and capacity utilization. The price of exports is determined by the domestic and the domestic price and the price of imports. And as Vietnam can be considered as a price taker globally, so the price of import depends on the import prices of the rest of the world. Now I will move to a few elements on the simulation side. So the basic principle of this SFC modeling is on the left-hand side, you have the inputs, so the equation system, the initial values, exogenous hypothesis on the exogenous variables and parameters, and you simulate that over time, either trying to fit past data, that's for the validation process, or in the future, that's for the scenario analysis. So let me directly move now to the application of this to the problem that we have at hand, which is the impacts of climate change. The idea was to propose an economy-wide assessment of the economic impacts of climate change and adaptation on the Vietnamese economy by using such an empirical stock for consistent macroeconomic model. We followed seminal paper by Seong et al. Published in Science in 2017 on the US economy via a combination of multiple climate scenarios, quantitative meta-analysis of sectoral and social impacts based on existing studies, and an aggregation integration within the macroeconomic CGE model in their case. So we kind of follow, at least partially, this method by using against multiple climate scenarios from CIEM 5 and then CIEM 6 in the latest COP27 report. Using also meta-analysis of sectoral and social impacts based on existing studies in Vietnam. And we have developed, particularly in the COP26 report, our own sectoral impact studies. And then we aggregate and integrate within this stock flow consistent macroeconomic model that I just described. In terms of the impacts that we consider the impacts on agriculture, energy, labor productivity, health and mortality, and total factor productivity. We evaluate damage functions based on different climate predictions. I will explain a bit more later. And then we aggregate into the macroeconomic model. On the agricultural side, to start with, so it's quite well known already that agriculture is one of the most affected sectors through temperature increase, rainfall, extreme weather events. And I think you had different sessions of this webinar series on these aspects. And the Vietnamese economy is particularly dependent on agriculture as the second largest rice exporter, for example, in the world in 2021. So we build on existing literature meta-analysis to come up with a rice damage function, so a yield change of rice. And we make the hypothesis, which is also made in the CIEM paper, that changes in agricultural yields are equivalent as changes in the rice yields themselves. So there is a transfer of 1-to-1 in the change of yields to the change of change of biophysical yields into the change in monetary yields. On the energy sector, we also use existing literature, and in the COP26 report, we have a specific study on the hydro sector. We look mainly at the two sides. Supply side, changes in rainfall and temperature can affect the energy production capacity, the transmission systems, or the infrastructure. But there is a dominant role of hydropower in total electricity production, quite important role in particularly for Vietnam. So we come up with a damage function that depends on temperature change and temperature change squared. And on the demand side, we look also at the way rising temperature and weather extremes change the demand for residential electricity. And we have also a specific damage function for the demand side. Then looking at labor productivity, there are different aspects to the labor side. So one is the work capacity that is affected, and then you can evaluate hourly worked output that is reduced due to temperature changes, particularly in Vietnam. But there is also a mortality risk that doesn't change directly labor, but that changes the population dynamics, although marginally. And we can come up with a mortality damage function. And finally, you also have the total factor productivity impact, which is different from just the labor productivity, the work capacity, or the mortality. And as total factor productivity is supposed to be a key component of Vietnam's GDP growth in the future, it is important to take that into account in a specific damage function. Now, in the COP26 report, we use this COP26, this CIEM 5 scenarios, climate scenarios, disaggregated over Vietnam by our colleagues from USTH and IMHEN as an input. And then we can assess the direct damages by adding the different direct damage functions that I just showed you. So we can come up with this kind of graph where on the y-axis you have the direct damages in terms of percentage of GDP loss, in function of the temperature change over Vietnam. And so you can see that there is an uncertainty range, obviously, but you can also have the good idea about what would be the approximate change for 1 degree increase or 2 degree increase in terms of GDP losses over Vietnam, or just the direct impacts. So here, at this stage, we don't use the macroeconomic model. The next step is to plug these direct sectoral impacts into the macroeconomic model and to try to assess the GDP losses via the macroeconomic model, depending on the climate scenario. So here we look at the RCP 4.5 and the RCP 8.5, for example. So RCP 4.5 is kind of optimistic scenario where we manage to mitigate most of the climate change in the 21st century. RCP 8.5 is more a baseline as usual scenario where we don't put too much effort on climate mitigation. And you see the difference in terms of impacts with the kind of uncertainty range. And the impacts are represented here in 2020, 2030, and 2040s. Another thing that is that we can do as well is to look at the difference between these direct impacts, so just the sectoral impacts, and the macroeconomic impacts, and looking at the ratio between the two. And the most important, let's say, chart here is the one on the left-hand side, looking at all damages. So if you look at the all damages section, you see the number 128, which means that the macroeconomic impact tend to be on average around 28% higher than just the direct impact. So that the macroeconomic, at least in our macroeconomic modeling setting, there is an amplification effect of the macroeconomic model of the direct damages. In the latest COP27 report, we updated all the climate scenarios to the CIEM 6 climate scenarios. So you can see that on the right-hand side here, you have the previous scenarios, RCP 8.5 to 2.6, which were the previous from the previous IPCC report. And from the latest IPCC reports, there is an update in the scenarios with tier 1 baseline scenarios and tier 2 additional scenarios of interest. And we use all these climate scenarios, again, disaggregated over Vietnam, which can be shown here. So it's much, there are many more scenarios here, all the SSP from 119 to 585. And we add also a representation of adaptation to climate change, which was not in the COP26 reports. And we make a specific hypothesis. We create an adaptation investment function. And this adaptation investment function is supposed to depend on two things: positively on the effectiveness of adaptation investment. So how much adaptation investment reduces the expected damages. So that's the first part of the equation here, and it will depend on the opportunity cost of the money spent on productive investment. So what you invest in adaptation, you don't invest in productive investment, let's say, and so this is an opportunity cost, and that should reduce the incentive to invest in adaptation. So the decision to invest in adaptation will depend on these two key parameters. On the one hand side, the positive side, let's say you avoid damages, but the negative side, you have an opportunity cost. You can't invest. You invest less in the productive economy. So that's the opportunity cost of investment in adaptation. The parameter P that you can see here in this equation, which is the effectiveness of adaptation investment, defines the level of total adaptation of protection in the end. So if you see the function P, when the adaptation capital is very high, it will reach a value which will be close to 1 minus gamma t delta t. So if gamma t, I will talk about it later, is 0, for example, the maximum protection could be 1. So you can protect against climate change, can protect yourself at 100% against climate change. But we make this hypothesis that the higher the temperature, the lower your capacity to adapt to climate change. So the higher the temperature, the harder it is for you to protect yourself at 100% from climate change. So you cannot actually protect yourself at 100%, and your maximum level of adaptation goes down the higher the temperature. So that's what's represented by this gamma t delta t. So what are the key simulation results here? That's an update, let's say, on the impact side of the macroeconomic impacts using the CIEM 6 scenarios. And you have two interesting lines, let's say the red, green, and blue vertical lines show the average date when the 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 3 degrees thresholds are trespassed. And for each of those moments in time, you can look in the graph below at the GDP loss compared to baseline. So, for example, if you take 1.5 degrees, you are around a 2% GDP loss compared to baseline scenario. But if you reach 2 degrees for Vietnam, you are on average a bit above 4% of GDP loss. And when you're beyond that, you reach much higher levels. Now we also look at the impact on government budgets of these temperature changes, and we can see that compared to baseline, even if in the SSP2 4.5 scenario, which is more optimistic, let's say, than the 8.5 scenarios, you still have quite some impacts on public debt without adaptation. You have also a real impact on GDPs. So in blue, it is without adaptation, so GDP loss compared to baseline with adaptation. And in red, it's GDP loss with adaptation. So adaptation in our parametrization of the adaptation function leads to lower GDP losses, but still you experience some important losses. Of course, we could have a discussion about the way to parameterize this adaptation function and how to better calibrate this. I think that's a key feature for future research, because I think the knowledge on adaptation investment and how to calibrate adaptation is still quite scarce. In terms of the impact on public debt, you also have a lower impact on public debt with adaptation than without adaptation, so which is good news for the government if it incurs adaptation investments. The financing needs of the private sector for adaptation investments are also higher, and they grow with time. So that means that the opportunity cost becomes bigger and bigger for the private sector as well, in terms of needs for adaptation investment. So I will stop here. There were a few last slides opening the floor to discussion about the next phase of CIEM 2 on the more net zero and mitigation side. But I think it's more relevant to stop here and discuss what has been done and not what we can do together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Etienne. So Dr. Dang, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Marie-Nguyen and Etienne. It's a very interesting presentation and very impressed work for the modeling and macro impacts. I think this work is very relevant and useful for Vietnam, in particular at this point in time, when we put a lot of effort and also commitment and attention to the climate change, as well as the net zero reduction commitment. So I think this kind of model is very relevant for the issues of climate change impact, as well as adaptation and even mitigations response of the climate change. It is a kind of complementary modeling works for the to the current modeling, this type of modeling in Vietnam. And we can see the one of the very strengths of the model is the financial sector and financial component in the modeling. And I know that you also put a lot of effort in this type of work, because financial data is not easy to collect, and but it's I think it's worthy to try and to develop this one, and to combine the real sector and the financial sector in this kind of modeling, and it will enable various simulation in terms of the policy, and also different scenarios for the adaptation and mitigations respond to the climate change. So I think it's in source, I very appreciate the works, and I think it's a good one, a very good tool for Vietnam to do the impact assessment, and also the policy design in the future. And I think I'm happy to know that this work will continue, and many room for improvement, and for in particular for updating the current situation, and in also the future direction. And for the presentation that you mentioned, I think very briefly about the result, the model, and also the result of the model, and the several simulation result. I very much agree with the way the model identify the several channels of the climate change impact, and is very in line with many others, some others study in this regard. In particular, the impact through the agricultural sector, and also the productivity, labor productivity, motility, and I think that is a good side of the work. But I also have, as I sometimes earlier, I also just concerned about the duplications of the impact assessment, in particular between the two productivity channels, labor productivity and TFP. Of course, the way in the model, the way you model these two variables are separate, and you can see it's not duplicated. But the way you collect the data, the damage data, I think it's duplicated from that one. And in the input data you put in the model, it may duplicate from that one, so it makes it the result a little bit maybe bigger than expected. But the fact is that the model do not cover all the channels, so still this result is still very considerable, and I think the impact, the loss of the updated result is 8.1% of GDP, is one of very alarming impact that we need to care more about the climate change impacts. And also it's very interesting for this time to simulate also some adaptation. You incorporate the adaptation, the investment and adaptation function. So I think it's very interesting to see the adaptation scenario will reduce the GDP loss by 2% as a result. So but also on the other hand, you mentioned about the increase in the public debt. So this one is I'm wondering that the way you simulate the adaptation here, so mainly will be on the government finance investment, right? So that's why it may increase the public debt. But how about, you also mentioned about the private adaptation here, but how to do it, because you also mentioned the opportunity cost. The way I think about the opportunity cost in this sense is that there will be no additional money or capital. So if you invest in to adapt the climate change, you have to reduce the capital or investment in another area, right? So that's why we can see the opportunity cost in that way. So then why the public debt will increase? So I think it will need a little bit more explanation in this issue dimension. And I also think that this the model is there are more potential to apply to use the many very interesting financial variables. For example, lending rate, interest rate. So it's we can have many interesting simulation in terms of the financing the adaptation for the climate change. So it's there are, I think, potential of using this model for further simulation in adaptation. And I also think that one of the one of the aspects. Maybe it's a little bit lacking in the model. And also you mentioned in the report is that the distributional impacts of this climate change. So I think this is kind of issue is also very important because it needs a little bit more disaggregate in terms of the household, right? Groups in the model. So I hope this kind of course, for the other model like CZ model, we can do that. We can complement this regard. But because here it also have a financial component, so I think if we can develop more expand the model to capture the distributional impacts of the climate change, or either later on the mitigation measure. So I think it will be increase the strength of the model and expect more a wider application of this model in the future. So I think so. In short, I appreciate the work, and I hope it can continue to expand in the next phase of GEM, and the power of the model will be improved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hoai. I appreciate all the very good comments. Let me maybe clarify a little bit on the adaptation side, on the adaptation question. So currently, adaptation is in the model is financed by government, firms, and households. So that's, you have this public debt effect, but you also have an effect on the private sector side. Obviously, major difficulty for adaptation, that's it's really difficult to empirically to calibrate or estimate. So you have to make strong hypothesis. So it's more a kind of scenario-based analysis, and there could be lots more detailed discussion about what happens if all adaptation investment is financed by government, or what happens if all of it is financed by the private sector. And we would look at the different macroeconomic effects that happen. So here we have just make a kind of average hypothesis on the way adaptation investment is financed, but it would need this kind of discussion with different government bodies about how it will concretely be financed, what will be the share of the private sector depending on the different types of adaptation, etc., etc. This we couldn't do, but I think no one really has done that yet completely, even within the Vietnamese government. So this is a room for further development. I completely agree also that there is much more room in the use of this model on the financial side, looking more at all these interest rate dynamics, exchange rate dynamics, and the balance sheets of actors in more detail. And that could be also, our focus was really on climate impacts and adaptation. So we've focused mostly on that. We look at some of those financial variables, but not all of them in a systematic way. And it should be also something really interesting for macro modelers at CIEM or within other parts of the government to look at that for different kinds of public policy scenarios. Actually, we worked on the ADB work. We have an ADB working paper looking at the impact of COVID and on the Vietnamese economy using this macroeconomic model. And in this case, we look much more details in this different financial dimensions. Now about the distributional impacts, that's clear. That's a limitation. That's room for further development, and that's surely will be part of the second phase of GEM. And I will let my my colleagues confirm that. Yeah, and then I know that your argument about the duplication of impacts, and I partially agree with that. So there might be in the model it's separated. So you have the labor, so the working hours impact and the TFP impacts that are separated. In the way we collect data, it's also different sources, but upstream there could be some some crossover. I agree, and that might be let's say bias upward in the impact assessment. But as you mentioned, we also are not completely comprehensive in all the potential impacts of climate change in this model, so that's downward bias in other aspects. Yeah, so let me just finish by saying that I also strongly hope that this modeling work will be brought to new levels with this second period of GEM with AFD, but also transferring the modeling tools to other international institutions such as World Bank, why not? And happy to keep collaborating on these topics in the future as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Thank you very much, Mrs. Hoai. So you, if you want to react, Mrs. Hoai, you have, let's say, 2-3 minutes, and then I'm sorry, I will have to close the webinar.
No, I completely agree with Etienne, and I just say that I look forward to the second phase of the GEM, and also the cooperation of the international organizations such as the AFD and World Bank to develop some of the interesting or strong model together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the second phase of GEM, we're currently in the inception phase, so really designing the work content. So I can just simply announce that we will have topics on a big focus on energy transition and its macroeconomics impacts, and how energy and macro interacts, and also things about social aspects of transition and adaptation. But I am not the one who will be in charge of these two research components. So hopefully the work plan will be defined very soon and released officially maybe in autumn. So we are running out of time. We have only 3 minutes left. So maybe we can take one question from the audience, but not more. And if there is none, I will just announce the next webinar and finish there. So is there any very quick question? Okay, so I would like to thank a lot Etienne for this presentation again, and also for the work which was done during the GEM1 project. Thank you very much also, Mrs. Hoai, for your participation and this very fruitful discussion. I hope also that this first work will further develop either in GEM2 or in other projects with cooperation in Vietnam or with international institutes. To conclude, so please note that the next and final session of this webinar series will take place not next week, as was initially scheduled, but due to constraint from the presenter, it's rescheduled on the 24th of May, so in 2 weeks from now. And this last session will be dedicated to a quite technical topic, which will be the role of retention basins against salt intrusions in the Mekong Delta. So I hope that people in the audience and yourself will be attending to this webinar. So thank you very much again to your participation. Thank you to the audience, and have a nice end of day.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
bye bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Mrs. Hoai.
Bye bye Hà.
Dạ, em chào
Bye-bye,
chị.
Hà.
Bye bye.